My name is Alegria with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar is Creating Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed Organizations, Applying NCDVTMH's revised ACRTI Organizational Reflection Tool. Our trainer today will be Kathy Cave, a Senior Training Consultant for NCDVTMH. Before we get started, I would like to go over some technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on using this webinar system tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have questions regarding the training content. You may contact Angelica Medina, also at the center, if you have questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click on the down-facing arrow and select the contact. You see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you would like to respond to a question from the trainer or to contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Angelica Medina to privately contact her if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on all participants, type in where you're calling from, and then press enter. Perfect. Thank you all very much. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. If this is true for you, feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We'll be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there's a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you don't want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. I will be moderating the Q&A at the very end, time permitting, and at the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Angelica Medina, you may call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any issues. That phone number, which I'll post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you all for joining today. I will now turn the presentation over to Kathy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. So today's topic, as Carla was sharing, is creating accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organizations. And we're going to be focused on applying the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health revised Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed Organizational Reflection Tool. And we are very excited about the tool itself and the toolkit that it's a part of, and it really is the coming together of a lot of work on the parts of many, many people, and I'll share some of our history. I'll share some tips and tools for using it, and some additional information about what's coming next. To begin, the webinar is supported by a grant from the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And the points of view in this webinar and then this document and the slides are those of the views of the presenters and not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So a little bit about the center for folks who may be joining us for the first time is we are one of 4 specialist issue resource centers funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Children and Families. Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. So our mission is to develop and promote accessible, culturally relevant, and trauma-informed responses to domestic violence and other lifetime trauma so that survivors and their children can access the resources that are essential to their safety and well-being. Our work is survivor-defined and rooted in principles of social justice. And I will be talking a little bit more about our framework and how we got here and the kinds of work and tools and resources that we offer. So we provide training, consultation, and resources to domestic violence and sexual assault agencies, advocates, health and mental health and substance abuse treatment providers, legal professionals, and government officials or policymakers on improving agency and system responses to survivors of domestic violence and other trauma. Again, on behalf of the Center, I would like to welcome you. We are invested today in the beginning of our series on creating and sustaining accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed domestic violence and sexual violence services and organizations. So our approach is part of a framework that's been, decades in the making and decades in discussion, and lots of work in having conversations about how these things come together. How do we think about accessibility? How do we think about being culturally responsive, and what it means to be trauma-informed? Part of what's happened over decades is really thinking about implementation. So we have lots of resources and tools and supports to think about what kinds of strategies would be helpful, what kinds of things, activities, ideas, thoughts can be generated so that we really can think about a solid way to approach implementation of ACRTI services. And as we're thinking about that, and have been thinking about that in partnership with coalitions and programs across the country, some themes kept coming up, and some of these themes are offered here. So how do we engage leadership? How do we have actual processes for reflection on what we're currently doing and thinking about ways that we can enhance our services? How do we think about staff support and just overall organizational well-being? How do we think about the process of change and change management, and then evaluating all the work that we're doing? So our part of this journey has really been about working together, working with coalitions and programs, thinking about these very complex and nuanced concerns and issues that will help us to better serve survivors and their children. So in that vein, we have two things that we've been working on. The first and most exciting is the topic of today's webinar, is becoming accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organizations, an organizational reflection tool, hot off the presses. We're really excited to share the content of it. It's available now on our website, so I'll say that again later on, but want to make sure that you all know that you can access it and it is available, and it's highlighted on our website. The second tool that is a resource that we'll be talking about in this webinar series is becoming accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organizations. And it's a guide to support implementation in domestic violence and sexual violence services. So as we're thinking about all of the ways that we've had energy and effort and, again, tools developed, ways of thinking about moving forward and moving the field forward, we're just really excited and passionate about some of the things that we're learning. And so when we talk about shared strategies that are listed here, these are shared strategies that have come up when we've been engaged in training, engaged in meetings, and engaged in conversations, and survivors and advocates have said, this is what would be helpful. This is how you can be more supportive of what we're trying to do. And here are some things that we've been thinking about. So shared strategies are those ideas that come from partnership with advocates and survivors and really thinking through again, what's the best way to meet some of the concerns that are surfaced. And then we also have additional resources available through our center that have supported change over a long period of time. So we're excited about this coming together of new tools and old tools and conversations that have led us to this place. The tools that we'll be talking about in this webinar series reflect an approach that we've come to think about as an integrated way of supporting survivors and people who are experiencing lifetime trauma. And one of the ways that we've put this all together is really thinking again about how are we holding all of these pieces. So our integrated approach really does reflect holding many, many pieces at once. So we understand that domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy and advocates who are doing that work, we have a lot of experience, firsthand experience, talking with people, really listening, really learning what those experiences have been about. So we always want to hold what we've learned and those experiences while we're doing all kinds of other things. So because we deeply understand trauma and its impact, we want to also hold that. And because we know that having a human rights approach and a social justice lens really does support us doing the best we can in this work and keeping in mind what it is that people want for themselves in terms of being safe, feeling safe, and not only getting justice, but being treated with dignity and respect in that search for peace and quiet and safety. And at the same time we're holding all of those things, we're also holding that there's a cultural context to people's experience. And so when we think about culture and we think about the historical and community context of people's lives, we recognize that we all have some similar experiences, but those experiences are shaped by who we are, how we identify, what we experience, and the meaning that we make of that. So our integrated approach really holds those pieces in a way that also honors being survivor-defined, which means that unless someone says this is what I want and this is the best for me, that we're not making decisions for people, we're making decisions with people, and only in a way that says this is what they want for themselves. So we're doing things together, we're doing things in partnership, we're really holding both physical and emotional safety and recognizing that hope and resilience are part of the fabric that people have in their core and that we support it, we try to be present, to honor it, and to recognize that our relationships and our ability to connect with people in our day in and day out really does depend on how able we are to hold all of these pieces as we're working together. So one piece can't happen without another, without being culturally responsive, without really understanding the impact of violence, without really holding a human rights and social justice context, we can't be trauma-informed. So all of these pieces really do connect and are held together. I want to spend some time today talking about the Organizational Self-Reflection Toolkit and to share it as a tool that was developed over much time and that there are versions of it that many of you may be familiar with. So previously, there was a version of the tool that was developed by a collaboration between domestic violence advocates, mental health, folks who worked in mental health, and folks who were really thinking about some cross-systems work together. And what we heard from the field is that it would be really helpful to have a version of that tool that hones in on what needs to happen in domestic violence and sexual assault programs to really support the transformational work of making our services more accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed. So this tool is specifically designed to do that. And I would like to just take a moment to recognize that this could not have happened without all of the staff who work at the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and that working with some amazing folks, and I'd like to just give a shout out to Carol Warshaw and to Erin Tinnen. Carol is the Executive Director of the Center, for those of you who don't know her, and Erin is a special service project consultant who worked on this particular tool a great deal, and we have other folks who just really contributed to every step of the development and creation of this tool. So today I'm a messenger around taking a look at what's in the tool, how we can be helpful in implementing the tool to really support the transformation that needs to happen in our services. One of the key highlights that I think is an addition to what was there and how it looks now is that the revision provides more guidance on accessibility, really thinking about what does it mean to be fully accessible? What does it mean to think about not just physical ability and disability, but to think about accessibility in terms of culture, in terms of attitude, in terms of all the ways that we demonstrate welcoming. And then there's also a focus, an expanded focus on community collaboration and how do we, as advocates doing the work that we're doing, also think about community collaboration in new ways. And how do we share our beliefs around the integrated framework and the values that we all hold? How do we share that across community collaboration? So really thinking about lots of ways to work together. And I wanted to spend some time thinking about our journey to this place. So again, at the center, we've been thinking about our understanding of trauma and how our understanding reflects a belief around how we define trauma matters. And so we think about interpersonal violence and we think about intimate partner violence in terms of what it is that happens on an individual level and what people experience. But we also hold in that definition ways of thinking about trauma that are related to the historical and community context of people's lives, and that there's history, and then there's cumulative burden and ongoing risk, and always holding that understanding as we think about then what does it mean for services. And then we thought about, well, what does it mean to be trauma-informed? And we have deep meaning, deep understanding that being trauma-informed has to do with how we look at ourselves, how we look at and work towards our personal well-being and our organizational well-being, how we think about really understanding that people respond to violence and distress in many, many different kinds of ways, and that to be trauma-informed means that really we need to be able to accommodate those differences and those meanings. So it's continually working to change the conditions that create violence, that create trauma, and being willing to keep reflecting and saying, okay, we did these things, and we can take the next step, and we can do the next thing. So all of this information together really did inform our integrated approach and our ways of thinking about what it means to be accessible, what it means to be culturally responsive, and what it means to be trauma-informed. As we think about the experiences that survivors have, again, I think this slide really sums this up for me in terms of there's ways that we each identify and talk about and think about what's meaningful and important, and way that we acknowledge our own resources and supports, ways that we can tap into our individual identity and our personal belonging, and then have access to others that we really trust and can connect to. And then there are experiences that can disrupt that can disrupt our ability to stay connected to ourselves and to trusted others. So historical experiences for sure do that. We transfer from generation to generation the experiences of trauma and the experiences of community and collective trauma. What does that mean, and what do those experiences say about who is trustworthy and who is not? And then as we think about our individual experiences with trauma and violence, in addition to those historical and community experiences, then those experiences can also be disconnecting. What's happening in our communities day to day and what's in the news and on social media can disrupt that sense of self and that sense of being able to trust others in the day-to-day. And the way that organizations treat people can be disruptive to identity and connection. So it's really thinking through behaviors and attitudes that organizations have that can be problematic, that can keep us from really connecting with survivors in the way that we intend to connect. So I wanted to spend some time thinking about then the tools and resources that could help us do that. So really looking at how do we make organizational change. There's current engagement that all of us have. So as a provider, if I put on my provider hat for a moment, that I have had a history with people who have been engaged in services with me, that as a survivor, I've also engaged in services, and that history is present for all of us. And when the experience of services is great, then I feel like I can go back. I feel like I can connect. I feel like I can make some trustworthy connection. But other times, and this is often true in services, that survivors' experiences and the intention of our services are not in alignment. And that when that happens, when there's a disconnect, it's often survivors who are blamed for that disconnection. So the stakes are really high when that happens because people come because they need something, or we reach out to people because we believe they need something. So when disconnection is the result of engagement in services, that doesn't feel good for anyone, it's not helpful for anyone, and again, the stakes are really, really high. So as we think through what is it that we mean by shifting behavior and attitudes, it's recognizing that there are themes in the way that we work and in our approach to change that can be really helpful in strengthening those relationships and actually having a nice alignment between what the services are we intend to provide and what we intend to do in our work and what we intend to do in our organizations and what people actually experience. So one of those pieces is around accessibility, that when we can really think about an accessibility focus, it's a cultural focus. It's, can people actually get here? When they get here, does it feel welcoming? Does it resonate? Does what we're trying to do actually show through? Do people feel like they can come back? Are we talking with people in the language of their understanding and the languages of their emotions? Are we really thinking about, in real ways, are people welcome? So that attitudinal access is, are there barriers that by the way we act, by the way, might be our body language, might be our environments, are we truly welcoming in all the ways that we need to be? Do the environments we create have enough flexibility where we can accommodate a range of experiences and responses? So when we say, welcome, we have to be careful that we're not saying welcome if you behave this way. We have to be clear that when we say welcome, we are truly welcoming. And transparency is also important in thinking about our intention and what are the possibilities. So if I say to someone, yes, you can call me anytime, I really am saying, call me anytime. And then that means if someone calls at 3, 4 in the morning, I have to be available for that. Or if there are limitations, let's be clear about those limitations. If we have rules in the places where we work, where there are behaviors that won't be tolerated, One is, can we rethink those behaviors? And two is, can we communicate transparently about them? So as we are, again, walking through, thinking through, talking about those things that make it possible for people to experience our services as welcoming, as open, as understanding, and making sure that if that's our intention, that that's what we're conveying and that that's what people are experiencing. And then the other piece for us to think about is how willing are we to adapt and change. And in that willingness, can we look at our services, can we look at our practices, can we look at our policies and say, yes, we're ready to think about making some changes, and can we ask people who are using our services who have said, yes, this was great, can we ask them for feedback? And more challenging, can we ask people who said, no, that wasn't so great, can we ask them what can we do better? How can we be better and have a greater alignment with our intentions? As we're thinking about attitudes and behaviors that we might want to shift, are we curious enough? Are we curious enough about who people are, about them bringing their whole selves, about really identifying what's important, what do people value, and having conversations about that rather than assuming. So cultural inquiry is that deep conversation about who you are, what you value, what you bring, who you are, at your core, and the meaning that you make of what's happening for you and to you and around you. And can we join people in that place? Do we have a commitment to listening and learning and actually taking in what we're hearing from each person that we have conversation with, and then using that information to shape services? And when we ask people about what would be helpful to feeling safe, that's physically safe and emotionally safe, what would be helpful, then we work together to create that, because none of us is that powerful where we can define safety for another human being and then create it. So if we're doing that in partnership and we're able to do that in partnership, then we have a better chance of actually making that happen, making it feel real and making it be real. So in the process of thinking about all these pieces of the integrated approach and what it means to be accessible and culturally responsive and trauma-informed, then we started thinking more about organizational self-reflection, and again, creating that from some existing tools and resources that we'd already had, to really thinking about how do we make this clear and centered in domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy. And then we had some additional requests from the field. And coalitions and programs that we partner with across the country were being much more specific, I think, in asking about, we have these tools and resources, we have some things that we've been doing, we've made some changes in our organization, and what we really need are some of these things. There are some unique needs related to the services that we provide in domestic violence work and in sexual assault advocacy work, where we're really hearing that staff have unique needs, and that because we are deeply steeped in our understanding of trauma and what it means to be trauma-informed, this really resonated in terms of, we need to think deeply about self-care. We need to think deeply about what wellness looks like on an organizational level, and how do we make contributions to that. We heard questions around where to begin, that this is such a big endeavor to take on organizational change, and to wanting to do a good job, wanting to do the right thing by the people that we serve, and wondering, is one place a better place to start than another? Is it better to start looking at policies? Is it better to start with, a particular challenge we're having at this very moment? So people were really engaged in conversation about that. That if we're starting an organizational change process, who gets involved in that? And how do we do that at the same time we're doing other work? How do we make space for that? How do we open up conversations about things that are hard to navigate and, stop what we're doing when we need to because we have, people that we are, seriously involved in supporting, to navigate some hard times in their lives. So how do we do all of that? How do we plan it out? How do we think about what's the role of leadership? What's the role of teams? How do we then keep this going once we start something? So people were very interested in having conversations about there's some changes that we made, and then, there was a shift. Either a staff person left, or there was a change in leadership, or there was a new funding crisis, or there was a new something that happened. How do we sustain change over time while we're dealing with all these pieces? So our goal was to improve the capacity of domestic violence and sexual assault organizations to address complex trauma, mental health and substance use needs of survivors and their children by promoting implementation of an accessible, culturally responsive, trauma-informed approach within programs and coalitions and with their partners. So we've been interested in this and working on implementation, again, for a long time, and really excited to have some new tools and resources to support that. And as we were thinking about the organizational reflection tool and thinking about kind of fine-tuning our focus on implementation, we intentionally placed the focus for change on program leaders and the resources and strategies to work with them in development of clear and sustainable change processes. And what I mean to say around that is that because there were so many stops and starts that programs were struggling with, or, again, big issues, these were not small things. These were funding changes. These were thinking about the everyday struggles of the work we do. These were things that we're thinking about ongoing oppression in the world at large, which is what that we care about, but also in the day-to-day experiences that people have experienced in doing this work. So much of the questioning, the approach to change, the trying to provide the best support possible was really looking at what's the role of leadership and how do we make sure that there's sustainable processes in place for organizational change to sustain change over time, over changing relationships, over different kinds of crises and struggles, over ongoing oppression, over all of the things that impact us because of the work we do and how we do the work and the experiences of the people we care about. So in focusing on leaders, one of the things that comes to mind for me is thinking about the change management and change leadership are not the same thing. So change management is how do we take care of that day-to-day stuff to try to keep everything moving forward. It's the detail of that. Change leadership really concerns the larger vision, the driving forces, the processes that fuel large-scale transformation, so that someone is holding the bigger picture, that as teams we can certainly participate and be on board and work to hold each other accountable. I think teams are good at that. But there's also a role for leadership in that there's some formal authority that leaders have. And that part of that formal authority is involved in initiating a process, clearing barriers away as they arise, really thinking together and holding space together. And in these processes, we can also share leadership. But when we work in structures that are hierarchical in nature, and we are passionate about understanding dynamics of power and how power is distributed and how we want to have every opportunity we can for sharing power and leveling the playing field, ultimately, when there's a hierarchical structure, we can't ignore that it exists. So it's taking advantage, taking notice, naming the power that's in place and saying, yes, this is real, this exists, and let's navigate together to figure out how to best work together. But to act as if the power dynamics don't exist doesn't keep things transparent and accurate. And so when you name it, then we can do things to have conversations to level it, to think together about strategies, but initially thinking about how do we provide support for people who are in that leadership role in organizations, as the way that many organizations and many of our organizations are structured. Acknowledge it, and let's think about how to best harness that leadership ability, that formal authority, and initiate a process together that can move barriers, that can elevate a process so that the process can stay in place. So that, often, again, we'll begin a process of change and it stalls out, it stops, or it shifts because of competing priorities. So what our strategies are in this learning series is really to speak to that there's formal authority that leaders have in many of our organizations and how to best work together in teams, naming what we're doing, naming the structures, surfacing challenges, working together through a solid way through the challenges that exist so that we can truly be focused on accessibility, on cultural responsiveness, and on being trauma-informed at all layers of our organizations. So ignoring it doesn't help, and the struggle is real, and let's figure out how we can do that. So one of the ways that we're working towards that is that these two tools, the Organizational Reflection Toolkit is one, and in our next webinar we'll be talking about a guide to support implementation of these principles and practices. So these tools will work together to support and sustain services and organizations that are accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed. So I'd like to now spend some time just talking a little bit about specifically what's in this toolkit and take us through some of the structure, the focus, ways that we can think about using it. So again, the key concepts or threads or themes are to focus on accessibility, to focus on being culturally responsive, and to focus on being trauma-informed. And that is, we have a suite of tools that we've been creating over time called Tools for Transformation, and that theme or these themes are represented in each and every one of our tools and resources. So I was talking a little bit earlier about kind of the power dynamics that we need to think about when we're considering organizational change. And intersectionality of all the different ways that people experience oppression is really important to talk about. So these conversations can be uncomfortable, they can be difficult, they can be challenging. They can also clear away barriers that are keeping people from feeling fully engaged. So when we talk about what it means to be accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed, the framework really does speak to ongoing analysis and a willingness to address the conditions, and that these conditions exist in all of our organizations, and really working to work through them, to talk about them, the impact of violence, the impact of discrimination in our lives, in our communities, in our society, and in all that we do. So it brings these conversations front and center, and again, these are not easy conversations, but they are important in planning for change. one of the things that can happen as we start these conversations about change is that we're actually expanding the vision and scope of our organizations. So we may have started from a mission and passion around providing safety, offering safety, and that may have been a theme for us. And then recognizing trauma and its impact, recognizing all the pieces that factor in to accessibility, that factor into being culturally responsive, that factor into being trauma-informed, and that all of these pieces really may stretch us and stretch our organizations to have deep conversations about power, about privilege, culture and inclusion, and existing microaggressions that may be barriers to accessibility. And that, again, these are not easy conversations. They're rarely smooth. They often will raise concern, and the process really involves a commitment to think about them, to work towards this, to spend time navigating microaggressions and how we talk about it, to navigating our blind spots around how people identify and what kinds of things we may or say or do in our organizations that are exclusionary. It may surface that many of us working in organizations have what I like to call a growing edge. And it's the work that we need to do as individuals that really may push us to some new or increased or greater understanding around what does it mean to really have a social justice lens. What does it mean when survivors say no, and that survivor-defined participation creates lots of space for that, or that any of our perspectives and principles that are part of our framework, that we're honoring hope and resilience, that this importance on relationship, that any of those things can be impacted when we are not paying attention to how we navigate microaggressions. They're impacted, and people are impacted in negative ways when they don't feel welcome or don't feel that these services are for them, or feel that if I conform to all of these rules and I fit in this box of identity that someone wants to put on me, then I am welcome. Well, that's claustrophobic. It's not freeing. It doesn't help. It doesn't support the development of services and organizations that are truly trauma-informed. So we have a growing edge that most of us have, some areas that we need to work on, and that having these kinds of conversations really does surface that and provides challenges for navigation. And so the question is, are we willing to hang in there? So in the development of the Organizational Reflection Tool, there's a piece on the front end about exploring readiness. And part of those readiness conversations really speak to what are you ready to do, what's your organization ready to do, and that those are different questions for different people. So if we're not talking about it together as a team, as part of readiness, and if as leaders we're not creating space for those conversations and highlighting those conversations, then everyone's not invested or included in the process or the planning. And as priorities shift and plans shift and change, then it feels more reactionary rather than planful. So how do we really think about the readiness? How will we navigate discomfort? How will the process be inclusive? How will we think about our organization? Do we need to revisit our mission? What is our vision statement? What are our values? Are we really talking about those things? Does it shift our approach to the work? If I look at the framework for being accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed, are the mission, vision, and values of my organization visible to me when I hold those things up? And what are the challenges if they do? What are the challenges if they don't? Can we talk about what's expected, how we're going to navigate this as a team, or will we have a small group, and then how will everybody else be included? There are lots of questions to consider where we begin and how we get started. and the Organizational Self-Reflection Tool does help with that. So it's a process of saying, we are going to take a look at our organization and imagine what we would want it to look like, and check in with ourselves and with each other about how are we willing to create this. Readiness also means exploring some attitudes that some of us may be aligned with each other's attitudes. There may be disconnections. So there are concerns that can be related to just the idea of change. We could all agree that it would be great to have our services and organizations align with these values that we've been talking about, but the process of change in and of itself is challenging, and that when we have changes in funding, we have changes in services, we have changes in who we serve, we have changes in how we serve, we have changes in leadership, we have changes in staffing, more change the idea of more change can feel overwhelming. So we can expect that there's a range of emotions that people might experience around implementation. Some changes may be related to policy, some to practice, some to our environments, some to our ability to provide a particular service. So often change can involve grief and loss and fear, and that those are to be expected. It's part of what human beings experience, but it also means we need spaces to think about that, explore the possibilities of that, and to talk about that. You know, how will we as a group discuss the reasons for change and change at this time? How will we discuss inclusion? How will we discuss really what does that mean? So if I'm not able to attend meetings about whatever process we want to implement, or if we're going to think about increasing our being culturally responsive or trauma informed, and thinking about ways that we have lots of barriers to accessibility. If I may be passionate about those meetings and about those changes, but I may not be able to attend. So how is it then that I might feel included as a staff engaged in this? So part of this, again, is for us to think through on the front end and explore possibilities and attitudes and recognize that this is daunting for some, depending on how we try to go about it and how we want to go about it. It also can be energizing and exciting and can build cohesion amongst teams and people that work together. And then also thinking about part of readiness that's important is, can we do this on our own? Are there challenges that are too big or uncomfortable or unclear for us to navigate on our own? Do we want to have an outside person come and support what we're doing? Are there other resources? How do we do this and have our daily operation continue to work? Because again, this can all seem so big and unwieldy. So as we're talking about the possibilities and as you're talking about that, what's important to hold true for navigation is to be transparent and really talk about, from these readiness conversations, there may be big themes that come up. There may be barriers that get surfaced. There may hopefully be some resources and supports that get surfaced, passions and challenges. Like all of this mix of conversation comes from readiness conversations. So it's important to be really clear going forward about, okay, so all of this stuff came up and you want it all to come up. How can we make some decisions together? And what are our priorities, and how will we decide on those priorities? And again, if you need an outside facilitator, it's a good thing to say, this would be incredibly helpful if someone helped us navigate this. There's no downside to that, as long as priorities do get set and the process continues to move forward. And that it makes a lot of sense, given all of the challenges we have in our organizations, that it's hard to keep focus on something that's really big and feels really unwieldy and feels daunting. So to have that be prioritized into some smaller pieces where we can really think together, or you can think together in your teams around, if we were going to do 3 things in the next 6 months to a year and a half, what might that be? So how can we get to prioritizing the things that make sense for us, where we can say, you know, I am wondering what kind of time frames would be useful to move forward this one next thing, knowing that we have 3 or 4 top priorities, and that those are all going to stay on the table. But in the next month, in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months, next 18 months, these are the things we want to do. And then setting those time frames that are realistic, that make sense for where we are and where you are. And then again, what kind of support is needed, whether it's a facilitator or some technical assistance, additional training, or just more information about the areas where you're thinking about exploring. So in the self-reflection tool itself, there's, after the readiness, there are areas for focus that guide some questions. So there's some indicators under each of these areas where you can reflect on, yes, we're doing this, where we could do better with that. This is where we're really strong. This is where we're doing some amazing things. This is something we'd like to change. There are indicators and strategies to do that. But these are the big areas for focus. Organizational commitment and infrastructure, again, starting with mission, vision, values work, and what is it that we might want to change or to think about or reflect on in that area. There's staff support and supervision. Again, when we're thinking about our organizations, part of this integrated approach is really thinking about what are the needs of staff and how do we support staff in our supervisory processes? How do we offer education? How do we offer opportunities for staff development where it's needed? And also how we hold each other accountable for the work that we're doing. Under physical, sensory, and relational environment, is there something in our physical space that we can change or reflect on to think about what's the impact our space is having in a physical sense? What's the noise, the sense, the lights, all that sensory stuff? Is that something we want to change? And then the relational environment goes back to the core values in our framework in terms of thinking about being survivor-defined, honoring hope and resilience, and recognizing the value and importance of relationship and connection. So people have been harmed in relationship. We want to do no more harm, for sure, and in a more open way, would like to have the best kinds of relationships we can that support people to be their best selves, both for staff and the people receiving services. So looking at our relationships in a way that says, are there things we can be doing differently that really honor being survivor-driven, and thinking about some resources and supports in those areas. We can look at our intake. We look at our programs and services, so how programs are designed and the services that we offer. We look at our community partnerships and think about, again, are there ways that we can strengthen them? Are there ways that we can be sure that our community partners have values that are in alignment with the ways that we're trying to work and then the ways that we treat people? Can we think about evaluation and feedback and actually ask, have we really been helpful? And making sure that we're asking people in a number of ways. So part of thinking about all the different focus areas is that once you finish readiness, the focus areas can be looked at in relation to where do you all believe your priorities are? What services from the readiness conversations about looking at mission and vision, about looking at our services, about getting feedback from folks, about staff supervision and support. So it really depends on what comes out of the readiness conversations. You may find that you're already doing a lot of things that are being suggested by the strategies that are offered in the reflection tool. But you also may recognize that there are areas that need to be strengthened, that additional supports are possible, that may be an area you haven't thought about in your organizations, but recognize here's an opportunity to do so. So some things might be new, some things not so new. You may be, in a position where in your organization you've done a lot of work towards change and really can use this to reflect on where you've been. And, that's also useful activity and conversation. So where you go depends on what comes out of the readiness conversation, and that each organization looks differently. It's not a prescription. You don't have to do it in a particular way, but based on reflection, deciding on where you want to go and some priorities for where you'd like to begin can be incredibly useful. I think some other themes that we've talked about in the creation or the refinement or the revision of this particular tool is really thinking about, in terms of inclusion, making sure that there's reflection and conversation and intention around the ideas of who's participating and how are we making decisions as a whole for our organization. And that folks who can give us feedback about services, who have experienced what we do, and can tell us whether or not there's been alignment with our intentions or not in terms of their own experience, those are the folks that can actually add a great deal of value to the team that's working on organizational change, and whatever ways you define that. So it's making sure that we're not just asking people, so how'd we do? And then we never let them know we heard them. We never really incorporate their feedback. It's how did we do, how are we doing, and can you be a part of our process for change? So it's finding ways to do that that are meaningful and that are valuable to the people that we've connected with. And that I think one of our challenges, and this speaks to some of the power stuff I was talking about earlier, is that people who are participating in this change process need to feel as if their voices matter, as if as an organization we are a learning and growing organization, and that we value the contributions of everyone that's participating. So it's both on an individual level, do people feel that they are part of something? Do they feel safe to make a contribution? And that's ongoing. But it's also, is our organization as a whole a learning and growing organization? And can we work through the discussions, not just in a way that honors the immediate participation, but also recognizes that the time it will take us to do this, so that there's no direction about how long you must work on a particular section. It's really more of, this is a priority for you. Here's some ideas about how you know if you got there, and you can work at your own pace in your organization to get to where you want to be. And that every once in a while we press pause and say, how are we doing with our change process? How is that working for us? I see reflection and this whole process of reflection as an opportunity to ask, what is it that we need to stop doing? What is it that we should continue to do because it's working and it's valuable and people are telling us it's valuable? And what is it that we want to start doing because it's something we noticed was missing or that we can do something in a different way? So the process of stop, start, continue is really very central to reflection. And in that vein, in the toolkit, we've also included for each of the focus areas, there are worksheets for planning and documenting decisions that can help keep your process moving forward. So it's important to think about planning. It's important to think about how you want to design planning, again, as a process, as part of reflection and readiness. And really important to think about then, what do we do with this information? that whatever the approach, we need to think about beginning. We need to begin. We need to actually implement something and try it, and then look at change in real time. So as we're talking about what's going well and what are our challenges, what kinds of resources we want to need, and saying, this is the time we think this is going to take, that our thoughts then need to get to, how will we know we succeeded? How do we know that we've done a good job? How do we recognize and check in about changes we've actually made? Because sometimes it can feel that without a plan, we've been spinning our wheels, or that things get so large and overwhelming that we can't see where we've been, and we certainly don't know if we want to continue where we're going. So this is where we've linked all of this to an implementation strategy and thought through one of the ways that there are different models for change. And this is one of the ways that I like to think about change, because it's focused on small things. So rapid cycle change strategies are a way to do exactly what I was talking about a moment ago. It's how do we look at, okay, this is the change we wanted to make. We think it's going to take, 3 months to work on this particular thing. We want to change our sensory environment. We notice that, it's really noisy, that there's, it's hard to talk with people, there's limited privacy. Maybe that's an example of a change we'd like to make. So we want to have some reflection on the sensory environment. We want to talk about that. And then we want to say there are things that we can do to make our sensory environment more inviting, more sensitive to people's needs, more flexible, more accommodating, all of those things. And then we want to write it down and say, okay, our plan is we want to change it, and we want to change it in these ways. And we'd like to do that over the next 3 months. That with short cycle or rapid cycle change strategies, you initiate the processes one at a time. We're not trying to change everything. We're not trying to do 4 things at once. We might want to just focus on the sensory environment and have some ideas to do that. When we know and have identified the change in policy or practice, we then want to experience how it works. So in 3 months, we want to change the lighting, we want to change the flooring, we want to, just put down some floor mats, or we want to put up a quiet sign or a quiet please sign, we want to have a quiet area, whatever those changes might be. And then experience it. So you let it be. And then let's say in 2-3 weeks, we want to say, how's that going? We want to ask people, how's that going? In another few weeks, we want to ask people, how's it going? We might tweak the changes we've made. We might add some additional changes. And then we want to definitely find out how it's working. And if it's not working well, you stop and you rethink and you move forward. So the idea here is that reflection and planning and change implementation are tied together in a way that honors where we've been and what we'd like to try. So the short cycle or rapid cycle change strategy is called plan, do, or implement. You want to check it, and then your action is either we're moving to a new change or we're changing, we'll make some tweaks to this one. And then when this feels good and right and real and feels like it's working and people agree that it's working, then we go on to the next thing on our list of priorities. It's useful and practical as an approach because it speaks to change that came from the process of reflection. So we know it's real and we know it's meaningful, and we know that people are invested in making the change. And then we're going to keep talking about it until we're all sure, all clear that it's useful, it's working the way we wanted it to work, or we need to tweak it and then we'll revisit it. But we don't move on from this until this feels right. I invite folks to, add to the chat box if you have an experience with trying out a change process that has felt good to you, that has felt hopeful, that felt like it worked, and feel free to share those things. Part of this implementation process really is about prioritizing things that are meaningful for the people who are engaged in the process. So this process of reflection being inclusive is really important. The process of reflection being meaningful, where you've talked about and removed as many barriers as possible so that people have ways they can participate, that's meaningful because the prioritizing that comes from that gives you information about the ways that change will be viewed as successful or not successful, as helpful or not helpful. Because if I wasn't included and the change that we're implementing doesn't really impact my life, I'm not going to see it as useful and helpful. If this change that we've implemented doesn't seem to have made any difference in the lives of people that I care about, so survivors that I care about in my work, then I may not be invested in it at all. So we really need to think through what bubbles to the top. And the things that bubble to the top for me are the ways that our services can be viewed by survivors and experienced by survivors as coercive. So when our services are felt, witnessed, experienced as, ooh, ouch, those things should tell us something. They give us information about that should bubble to the top of the things that we consider. We should also think about anything that inhibits or prohibits access and participation in our services. So in that light, it takes people with different views and different perspectives, because one person may not see an access limitation where someone else might. So it's opening up in this inclusive way participation, because it tells us that, it's like if you look a certain way, if you behave a certain way, if you have only some concerns but not others, then our services can feel like an easy task for someone, or a way to get through where people feel helped and supported and really good about what they experience. But if I look a certain way and have certain behaviors and certain experiences, it may not feel like an easy task for me. It may feel restrictive to me. It may feel impossible to me. It may feel unwelcoming to me. So the reason to include all the different perspectives in reflection is so that when you're prioritizing, you have a lot of information to make decisions about. Is there physical, cultural, and attitudinal access to all of the services we offer? And what this question surfaces for me is that some of our services may be very accessible where others may not be. So opening up that conversation may bring a different lens to what are our priorities when you talk about that, when you have those conversations. Are there improvements that we can make in the ways that we actually listen to survivors and include their feedback in service design, in service delivery, and evaluation? So here's something that many of us will think about is, oh, yeah, we do that. Well, there are different ways to get feedback from people who have used our services, who have experienced them, participated in them, in the ways that they can judge their participation. It was their experience. They should be telling us, if you change this in the way you do that, so that's design. If you change this in the way that you offer it, that's delivery. And if you really want to make change, actually engaging people in the process of evaluation, not just here's an evaluation, but what to ask for evaluation, how to shape those questions, and involving survivors in every aspect of the process. And again, at the center, we've been, over years working on evaluation tools to also support this process. Are there improvements that would change and enhance and make better staff support and overall organizational well-being? And often that question is put kind of where it is on this slide is it's at the bottom. But what if we raise the priority of staff and staff support and organizational well-being, really thinking about in some very concrete ways, are there things that we can do so that staff feel better, are better, and are at their best selves when they come to work? So ways that we think about these questions can help us shape priorities. We also need to think about ongoing opportunities for learning. So in the process of self-reflection and looking back on our organizations and then looking forward to planning and implementation, there may be additional training needs, technical assistance, resources, or facilitation assistance that you need in your organizations to support a process of change. And that can be useful in both the exploration process, but can also be useful in planning or during implementation. So along the way, part of your checking in within your organization is related to how are we doing, how are we checking in, how are we thinking about additional training, technical assistance, and other kinds of resources. It may be helpful to have learning conversations with other organizations that are actually doing what you're doing. So as folks are using organizational self-reflection, checking in with other people who are doing your work, who understand the focus you have in your work, and asking about how are you doing with that, how are you checking in? And using those opportunities to either reflect on engagement and inclusion, so who's invited to those conversations, is there anyone who's left out, to think about priorities in terms of what we were just talking about. Is there anything that's inhibiting survivors' participation? Is there anything that would be helpful to enhance staff well-being and our whole organizational sense of well-being? Is there something that others are doing that might be a really great idea for engaging people who work on different shifts when everyone can't be part of the process at the same time? So there may be some strategies that other folks have come up with that really have addressed those concerns and issues. I think one of the things I wanted to share is that several coalitions have found that in working on implementation strategies, that working with a small number of member programs while you're implementing organizational change has been incredibly helpful. And it's also, again, part of how we got here with coalitions and programs kind of raising and surfacing issues around what would be a more helpful way. We get this far and we get stuck. Or we're worked with one program and we found that when we worked with three, that they were able to support each other in these processes of change and implementation. So it's thinking, again, what would be most useful and helpful to support organizations in their ability to stay connected to a process of change and to do it in a way that feels good, that staff are excited about, that people engaged in services recognize, wait, this is a shift and it feels different and it feels right and good. So again, just welcoming folks to take advantage of those opportunities. So I wanted to pause for reflections and questions and see if there's anything that those of you who are listening would like to offer in terms of either your experiences around change and education, or thinking about ways that people can connect, thinking about sustainability, thinking about navigating the challenges that come up during readiness. It's hard to look at your organization sometimes and say, oh, yeah, we need to change that, and to also feel energized about it, but it's possible, and that people have had some suggestions in the chat box about the ways that they have done some of those things. So we can't be afraid of change. You may feel very secure in the pond that you're in, but if you never venture out of it, you'll never know that there is such a thing as an ocean, a sea. And that's a quote by Joy Bell C that I wanted to share with folks. Again, any questions or reflections that folks wanted to share? Let's see, there's a note that someone put up in the chat box that we include clients on our trauma team. Their perspective has helped to assist in change. Thank you for that. That's from Cheryl. I think one of the strategies that someone offered a few moments ago was around doing some anonymous polling. I'm working with an organization that is implementing some change and doing a lot of kind of thinking about reflection and how to focus the way they want to do their organizational reflection. So they've had some readiness conversations. They're thinking about, wanting to focus on one area at a time out of the different focus areas. And what they decided to do was to put some sample questions related to each focus area in a poll and ask each staff member, which of these areas would you most interest you? Which of these areas is most concerning? Which is most intriguing? Which is most exciting? And they're in that process right now of really thinking about that. And so their approach before they do more reflection is to pause and think about which area of focus they want to hone in on. They spent a great deal of time really having readiness conversations over the past 6-7 months and are thinking about, we're thoughtful about this is the way that works best for us. So I wanted to check in with Carla or Angelica to see if there are any questions.
There haven't been any questions. However, there was a comment by Jennifer saying they had a similar experience to Melanie, and Melanie's comment was, I've been involved in organizational change shifting to a more social justice lens, and the ripple effects were very powerful. It's amazing how our language and design can send unintended messages that are unwelcoming and present barriers.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And it's, I really appreciate, both the comment and the liking of that comment, because I think one of our challenges, is that we're passionate about the work we do. We are committed to the work we do. We are acutely aware of the stress and distress that people experience because of the work that we do. So we have that awareness as human beings. And it's hard sometimes to have conversations when you really kind of lift the lid on those social justice conversations and talking about the intersectionality of oppressions. We start to talk about and think about the microaggressions that many of us experience, every day. We start to talk about things that are deeply painful, and that often the response to that is to step back, and it's hard to lean into those kinds of conversations. So really would like to think about what are the ways that we can keep those conversations, acknowledge that they're hard, but the silence is more challenging. I think when people have to suffer in silence or experiencing that kind of oppression every day without an opportunity to share it, to talk about it, and to navigate it, is harmful. And so the more we can learn, the more we can be open, definitely better for moving forward with honesty and transparency and care.
Kathy, we have had a couple of questions in the meantime.
Sure.
Alyssa asked, do you have any suggestions on helping programs prioritize the conversations on privilege and intersectionality when resources are short, or ways to build that into grants?
So, yes, and. I think the yes is to have time. And this is a suggestion from advocates that, I've had the pleasure to learn from, really thinking about carving out the time to have those conversations and keeping them moving forward. An example from one of the programs that we've worked with is really to say, every, once a month or twice a month or 3 times a month, and these are the days we're going to actually use this time for staff to meet and have these conversations. We're going to talk about structural oppression. We're going to talk about how that's experienced by people here. We're going to talk about, again, lifting the lid on that and doing that. And what I can tell you is that the program that made that commitment also initially brought in a facilitator where they worked with some folks, nationally known folks over time around this particular issue, and did that first before they looked at any further other kinds of organizational change. And over many months, we're appreciative of this facilitator, then figured out a way to carry on those conversations on their own and continue to move forward to this day on keeping that time held sacred for those specific conversations. There are certainly funding sources that will facilitate development of these kinds of conversations and resources. And what I can say is that as staff, if we can consider that as a TA question, and if we know of anything, we'll continue to share that. Off the top of my head, I can't recommend anything specific, but to really think through that those conversations take time and commitment and energy, and commitment can be hard to hold. So it's really deciding as a team that that's the direction you want to go in and meaning it.
The other question was from Sarah. Have you heard of non-victim service providers using a tool such as this for organizational change? I'm wondering about courts, child welfare, etc.
Yes, and. So there's a lot of work being done in child welfare around these same kinds of issues. There are resources and supports for doing this sort of work and tools for reflecting, and primarily they are geared towards human service organizations, is something I will say. I think what you'll find in more corporate kinds of settings is people want to talk about diversity. There are some who want to talk about, unlearning racism, and that certainly there are, again, other kinds of resources and supports out there, but they may not be this comprehensive. And one of the things that I've appreciated about the development of this particular set of tools and the framework from the center is that, in 30 years of doing work related to the intersection of trauma and cultural inclusion, that this was the first place where the framework incorporated all of these perspectives, and that being trauma-informed was a piece of it, and that all the other pieces are essential. So I think that is unique in the work that we're doing. Carla, were there any other questions or thoughts?
No, that seems to be it for now. Okay.
So there is something in the chat box. Let me just respond to this because it's here and we have a minute. Does the toolkit include surveys or questionnaires that organizations can use to obtain input from outside of their organization? This particular tool does not. This particular tool is really about internal organizational reflection. So it's something to think about and something we can certainly take back to the team for further thought. But at this point, we really wanted to engage and provide opportunities for domestic violence and sexual assault programs and coalitions to engage in this process of self-reflection, so that it created an opportunity to really hear from staff, to really hear from leaders, to really hear from people engaged in services around what is and is not working about those services. And so highlighting the strengths and resources, but also thinking through what are our opportunities for improvement and providing some real strategies to make that happen. So there are some additional resources I wanted to make sure that you all knew about. There's the framework that we've been talking about, and that there was the graphic of that framework. There's a full document that further describes the integrated approach. And also in our Tools for Transformation, Guiding Principles for Change Management is a resource that we wanted to make available. So some strategies for thinking through, if you're guiding the change process, what's helpful. Please join us on May 29th for webinar number 2 in this series. So in this learning series, we've had our webinar today. We'll have our next one on May 29th. And then over the next 6 to 18 months, we'll have many other webinars in the series, depending upon issues that surface in the implementation process for anyone who's engaged in doing it. So we invite everyone to really let us know if you're working towards organizational change and there are topics or issues that come up in the process of doing that. Let us know what they are, and we'd really like to incorporate your feedback and thoughts into future webinars. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you for an exceptional webinar today. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Angelica for making the webinar run smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the Center. Within the next week, we will send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to slides and handouts referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. I'll add Kathy's email if anyone has any more questions to that follow-up email as well. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment and let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and we hope you have a great afternoon.